Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly edition of The Wrap. I'm Laura Leslie, WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief.
And I'm Bryan Anderson, WRAL State Government Reporter.
And it has been a week, Bryan, has it not? We've had two presidents in town. We had a debate that WRAL put on. I think, it was very good, although it was sort of missing somebody. We have a brand new WRAL news poll out and a hearing in the Leandro case. I mean, it's like, where do you want to start?
Yeah, and it was opening week for baseball, so I have my festive Oakland A's tie for the people who can see this. But yeah, it's been a crazy week in North Carolina politics. It started, if you want to go back to last Saturday with former President Donald Trump in Selma. He had a rally where he boosted several different congressional candidates, Dan Bishop for the new 8th, Greg Murphy for the 3rd. He also encouraged, he boosted Ted Budd for U.S. Senate, who he had already endorsed last year. He's also supporting Bo Hines in the new 13th district, which is outside of Raleigh, and he's backed Madison Cawthorn in the state's westernmost district. So Trump coming out to Johnston County. I would point out, 2016, there were 15,000 people at this exact same venue, and the crowd was noticeably smaller. I've seen some estimates of 1,000 to 2,000 people. I thought it was a little bit higher than that, but certainly not the same crowd size.
It's not a presidential election year either, But yeah. I mean, it is true, and it was a nice day to be out there too. So anyway, so that WRAL news poll that I mentioned, that came out on Monday, and we found kind of similar to some other polls, Budd with a 9-point lead over McCrory. So
I think 10 points.
Was it 10?
Yeah, 33 to 23. I know Bud's team is going to come at you and want to hear that extra 1 point difference.
I think it was 32 to 23.
Okay.
But anyway, yeah, it's still very a substantial lead. So, and not surprisingly, Mr. Budd did not come to as we were talking about last week. Like I mentioned last week, we weren't going to do a Senate debate. Well, we decided to do a Senate debate, but Mr. Budd was not there. So I'm sad that he was not there, but we did get some great time with Pat McCrory and Mark Walker to talk about their positions.
Yeah, and worth noting, this isn't the first rodeo that Congressman Budd has skipped out on. He declined to attend this February debate, which was hosted at a conference put on by the John Locke Foundation, but moderated by the Carolina Journal and ABC 11, and Budd didn't show up to that. There was actually an empty podium for that debate. WRAL just had, the two lecterns there for McCrory and Walker. Eastman wasn't invited, but there's also a couple more debates that are expected to be coming out in the next week or two, and it'll be interesting to see if Budd agrees to those, but all indications are that will not be the case.
I mean, my gut on this is there's not really a need to, I mean, he's got money. He's running this as an air war. And, if you're the leader in a race, I mean, basically, especially with that kind of a lead, you're really only going to do harm to yourself at that point. By possibly screwing something up or getting something wrong, or exposing yourself to a counterattack. But it's not like they didn't attack anyway. They certainly spent a lot of time talking about the man who was not in the room last night. But we'll talk about the debate a little bit more in a minute here. Pardon me, sorry. So I wanted to go back to that Senate race poll. What we found is that 33% of people were still undecided. That kind of surprised me at this point. Out from the election, and people are already able to get mail-in ballots.
Yeah, I've asked consultants and advisors, is that a sign of frustration with the existing field of candidates and displeasure with the options? And if you ask the campaigns themselves, they'll say, no, it's not dissatisfaction with the candidates. It's just a sign that the election date has changed so much. People have to worry about inflation and gas prices and have more important things to be thinking about in their mind. But our survey is of likely Republican primary voters. These aren't average, everyday North Carolina adults. These are likely primary voters who are telling us, at least one of 3 of them are telling us, that they aren't decided and haven't made up their mind.
And, on the other side is even more undecided. And the Democrats was like 54% still didn't know. Of course, it would be a real surprise if Sherry Beasley did not take that race, obviously. But I think a lot of people just are not engaged in this. And, we had, according to the people who answered our news poll, we should have record turnout for this primary coming up. But somehow I don't believe that's actually going to happen. The last non-presidential year primary that we had with 2018, and the turnout for that was 14%. So I think a
Yeah.
lot of people are just not going to vote.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly an election year where I would say people are frustrated on both sides of the aisle. And we've seen this growing polarization throughout our recent election cycles. And I have no reason to believe that that frustration with both parties won't only exacerbate and continue in the coming years. But, frustration is a motivating force. People are upset with the president in power during an off-year election, and people are opposed to the other party trying to outdo the current party. So it's just a big mess, and we'll have to wait and see what happens on May 17th to truly know.
So I want to go back and mention a couple other kind of surprising results that we found in our WRAL news poll. We asked about sports betting and marijuana legalization, and we found really enormous support for both of those, which is pretty amazing. The sports betting had overwhelming support, even among the very most conservative voters. It still had a plurality, which shocked me. That was a bill that, Jason Sane has been running, and some other people, I think John Hardister also, to legalize online and in-person sports betting. So that was an interesting poll result to see for him.
I mean, you look back at the North Carolina education lottery and just the controversy in the early 2000s from that, and this outrage to gambling that some conservatives had and were very opposed to it. And now you can also see, even among conservatives, they like their sports. Betting is already fairly prolific for anyone who wants to bet on sports games. They can do that. So the question is, why not tax and make some money out of it in the process?
And the pollster that I talked to made a good point. He said, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you thought of sports betting, it was bookies and people getting threatened to have their kneecaps broken, but now it's not like this seamy thing anymore. It's sort of like big business. You see DraftKings, sporting, a lot of like sports pubs. You can see what the odds are on these different sites. It doesn't seem so seedy because there's not sort of the mob connection in the crime world, it just seems more normal. So I hadn't thought about that, but I guess he's right. I mean, the explosion of technology just puts it in everybody's fingertips.
Yeah, for sure. And North Carolina is a big sports state, as we saw with the Duke UNC Final Four as well. So North Carolinians love their sports.
We should mention Travis Fain had a great story today about that game, about specifically the state officials that showed up at that game.
Yeah, you had an unlikely pairing with Governor Roy Cooper and House Speaker Tim Warner, who
right,
both attending that event. And the other interesting thing was, I think UNC had made those tickets available for $206 to Governor Cooper and House Speaker Moore. And I was looking at Darren Rovell's Twitter account. He's a good sports reporter. And I posted on my account, there's like these $750 nosebleed seats nowhere close to the floor. And, Cooper's team, I believe they said this wasn't a taxpayer expense, but, it's still I would love to go to the Final Four for $200.
It's a pretty sweet deal. It definitely was a pretty sweet deal. And it was kind of fun to see Roy Cooper and Speaker Moore sitting next to each other wearing the same shirt. That was fun.
Yeah.
So anyway, moving on for the poll, did want to mention that on Wednesday, I think it was Wednesday, we had a fairly significant hearing in the Leandro case. Now, you might remember the Leandro case. This has been going on forever and ever, it seems like, at least since the late 90s. And the new judge in the case, Michael Robinson, was appointed by Newby when he kind of unappointed Judge David Lee, who's been overseeing this since, I think, 2016. So today, or that day rather, Wednesday, was the first sort of hearing at which he heard the arguments in the part of the case that's been remanded to him by the state Supreme Court, which is trying to figure out what effect the state budget, which was passed in November, has on what Judge Lee said the state owes to pay for the comprehensive remedial plan that's supposed to make schools better and resolve Leandro. So, of course, the state says we already spent enough. Advocates say they didn't spend enough, and they also didn't fund a bunch of things that were in the plan specifically. So that was that.
And that wasn't the only big news on Wednesday either. We had former North Carolina congressman and former chief of staff to former President Donald Trump, Mark Meadows, in the headlines because state elections officials say that they had removed Meadows from the voter rolls. The reason being that he voted in the Virginia election in 2021 while still being registered at this home. It's a mobile park 4 miles north of the Georgia border in a town called Scaly Mountain, this unincorporated community. If you know anything about Mark Meadows, it's awfully hard to picture him in a $100,000 mobile home park. And the former owner has previously told us that Meadows had never spent any time there as well. So it
That's
raised,
awkward.
yeah, it raised all these suspicions, and the Attorney General's office actually asked the State Bureau of Investigation to investigate this matter, and the State Bureau of Investigations told us that that investigation is still pending. They're looking into potential voter fraud. And the last important piece of context is this is a man who has routinely spread false information about the 2020 election.
And voter fraud.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
the real irony is mail-in balloting, where Meadows himself voted by mail in 2016 and 2020, according to records that we've obtained and reported on. Those documents are out there. And this is the same person who championed and echoed Trump's critiques of mail-in balloting that he himself had utilized.
I want to talk a little bit about the debate on Thursday. I mean, Lena Tillett was our moderator, but a lot of us spent a lot of time this week kind of putting together the questions for this debate. Once we decided we were having it, which was kind of a surprise on Monday. But how do you think it went?
It was interesting. So we have a story on our site at nccapital.com if anyone wants to check it out, with our top 7 takeaways. And the first one has to be the elephant not in the room, with Ted Budd, who we mentioned earlier, not there. And the pushback that we heard in the debate from McCrory, from Walker, was basically twofold: that Budd is hiding behind special interests and his campaign's not letting him debate. And the second criticism was really, hey, if you can't debate in a GOP primary, how are you going to take on a Democrat in the general election, with Sherry Beasley being the presumptive nominee? So the response from the Budd campaign was, hey, we'd rather talk to voters. I haven't heard of a 21st century North Carolina primary debate that changed an outcome, and we're trying to hit all 100 counties. And the interesting part of that is, instead of attending the WRAL debate, Budd's campaign told us that Budd was in Wake County and Johnston County, places he's visited multiple times, nothing crossing off the new 100 counties that he hasn't been to list. So that's why Budd wasn't there. That's the pushback and the intra-party drama, if you will.
I thought, though, we did try to come up with a fairly good cross-section of questions for McCrory and Walker, and I was intrigued by some of their answers. I think specifically, I think Mark Walker was talking about ways to combat workforce shortages, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was saying his fundamental point is, unless we get the budget in check, and he cited how he had put a balanced budget amendment on the House floor when he was in Congress. And you can't really address the labor shortage unless you have a balanced budget, was sort of his point. And McCrory talked more about his past business experience, his ability to reduce unemployment. And he criticized these early pandemic stimulus checks that went out to people that he believes was a disincentive for employees to go to work. And so that's the biggest takeaway from the inflation point. The one that stood out to me was McCrory saying he doesn't regret signing HB2. This is an issue he hasn't wanted to talk about on the campaign trail. I've personally tried several times to get him to say yes or no, whether he does regret signing it. And in the debate, he initially didn't answer, but then when pushed for a response, he did flat out say, no, I don't regret signing it.
That's an interesting choice, since it may have cost him the 2020 gubernatorial general election. So
2016 one.
Sorry, 2016. Gosh, time flies, right?
But yeah,
who do you think had the better night, though?
It's hard for me to say with winners and losers. I thought it wasn't a debate that was between the people on the stage. It was a 2-on-0 debate with Bud not being there. So what I come from it is just wondering, what do voters now know that they didn't before? And I think you're still in the same spot of not really having a debate with Bud and getting a clear understanding of his policies. And my takeaway is it's a loss on a substantive policy discussion that voters care about and want to hear these candidates talk about. Even if it might not sway the outcome of an election, voters care about these issues and ought to have their questions answered.
Absolutely agree with that. That is 100%, 100%. So, I mean, anytime you see a candidate who only runs commercials and doesn't take questions, I mean, they're controlling the message completely, but they're not interacting with you. So, but we do hear that he does a lot of retail. So I'm sure he's interacting with people on the ground.
And one thing they would point to is there's been criticism from McCrory's side specifically that Bud is a ghost on the campaign trail. And the response from Bud's team, they provided a schedule to WRAL that showed he actually did more interviews and did more events between, the start of 2022 and mid-March than all the other candidates. McCrory didn't provide us that schedule. Marjorie K. Eastman did, Mark Walker did. So we have that basis of comparison. But even if you ask Bud's biggest supporter, Club for Growth, they describe Bud as, quote, going dark. So even Bud's own supporters acknowledge there was a period of relative quietness there.
Well, and I mean, to be fair, well, now it's not really apples to apples because there's not a big race on the Democratic side, but you really haven't seen much of Sherry Beasley either. I mean, yeah. she put out her first ad I think just this week. But I mean, she's widely expected to win the primary, hands down. And you can certainly make an argument for saving your gunpowder, saving your money, and laying some of the groundwork for the general election. But it is interesting that the two sort of front runners are sort of the two that you're not seeing. So
and the other interesting thing was Beasley didn't attend the Biden event at North Carolina A&T, I heard. It'll be interesting to see the dynamic between Beasley and Biden and whether how closely you embrace a president with lower approval ratings in this election cycle, for sure.
Well, our poll found Biden at 55% disapproval. So it might have been a good call on Beasley's part.
But Biden did go to North Carolina A&T this week. He wasn't the only current or former president to visit North Carolina recently. And it's just worth noting that I didn't go to that event, so I'm not as familiar with the specifics of it, but it's certainly notable that Biden would be here in the state.
Yeah, and he chose NCA&T to make his announcement about his plan to control inflation. You can find a lot more about that on WRAL.com, a pretty good write-up of that from Wednesday's event. Is there anything we didn't get to that we should have gotten to, Bryan?
I know FEC, we're recording on a Friday, and these FEC filings will be coming out today. Obviously, check nccapital.com in real time as we have some stories that are planned for that. But it'll be interesting to see which candidates pull ahead. I know Marjorie K. Eastman has released her filings. We're going to wait for the other Senate candidates still. But by the time you hear this podcast, we might have a few updates on who's up and who's down on the fundraising game.
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, and I think starting next week, you're going to see a lot of some election stories coming out about who's in what races and sort of how they're doing on the fundraising thing, as well as on the campaign trail. So we'll look forward to that.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, hey, everybody, have a great Easter weekend. Whatever your religious belief is, have a nice holiday weekend. How about that? And we'll talk to you next week.